the people of Streatham, the people that have been challenging this day in, day out, week in, week out, that have consistently made the case about the impacts, the limits, and what people can do locally. Now, as you say, Christo, it is a suspension. It's not the ending. There's works on the A23, but it's become infamous for the kinds of problems that we've seen in a number of areas in terms of real congestion, limits, restrictions, impacts across the areas, a contradiction to the idea that it's going to improve health somehow when everyone's bottlenecked and actually using up more petrol, and, you know, when the fumes are running like that, much more. But we've got to say that it's not just Streatham. We've seen this across London. I was, you know, yesterday in Enfield, and increasingly there's limits and filters and, you know, long congestion in many areas. We see all over Newham conversions of roads being turned into basically park areas with huge congestion on boundary roads, and internally we see it in Hackney and in Islington.
Actually, and just jump across the UK, we're seeing it in Oxford, we're seeing it in Birmingham, we're seeing it in Newcastle, we're seeing it across the United Kingdom. I mean, some people wonder whether this is a London story. It really isn't. It is across the whole of the United Kingdom.
You're absolutely right. So in Warrington, the good people of Warrington campaigned and challenged and got them taken out. In Newcastle City Council, the council, to their credit, did listen and took them out. Now, we've seen some reports about this most recent situation because many of us, tens of thousands of people, we should remember the numbers, tens of thousands of people wrote into the Department for Transport saying they were opposed to LTNs, they were wreaking havoc, they were having impacts across the board in terms of women travelling late at night, deliveries, people disabled, but just our general mobility and freedom. So what happened was that there's been a survey, a research, some kind of sort of attempt to get some kind of sense back from certain areas. Now, the Guardian's put out a report, as we know, but no one's seen this report. Sorry, they've put out an article on the report. And you know what's so interesting about the article by Peter Walker, who is an advocate of cycling and, you know, maybe as his name suggests, walking. I love cycling, by the way. I do it very often, but I don't think, like David Lammy, that everyone should be forced to go on the train with their tools so people can cycle a bit, because many people can't do that, as we know, working people every day. But what's interesting is it's a bit like people talk about some of the consultations and they like focus in on some areas. We don't know the actual overall questioning. We know it's only in 4 areas. We know it's 1,800 people. We know tens of and hundreds of thousands of people have been challenging these LTNs around the country consistently now for this last period. So we'll wait to see what this report actually says from the Department for Transport and what the actual figures are and drill down on them. But one of the problems that's been involved in this, and we should really be very clear about this, is partly our local democracies and nationally, but particularly locally, because it's easier because far less people are voted in, are being hijacked by a few green billionaires. The report that Together put out recently with Ben Powell showed that a few very wealthy green billionaires are basically funding and underwriting any discussion, all discussion on net zero, and consequently giving money a lot to the academic institutions and publishing. And it's virtually impossible to even ask questions about the terms of reference on net zero and about the discussion in terms of getting work published, in terms of getting questions by MPs and councillors. Effectively, the public sphere has been really lobbied, hijacked by this one view of an agenda, and at the same time has been linked to the clean air agenda and lobby, where lots of so-called campaigning groups, grassroots activists, are not grassroots activists. They're all funded by a few of these green billionaires. We see that UK 100's getting money from these people. We know that obviously Sadiq Khan is chair of C40 cities, not democratically elected, mayors from around the world with a kind of a view about how things should be done. And as you say, Christo, this all came in under emergency traffic orders, all under the auspices of lockdowns. And we're seeing this gridlock, effectively, this situation where surveillance, restrictions, limits, fines. Remember, Haringey, £2 million in just 2 to 3 months of their LTNs. People are furious and unhappy. And to say that somehow the majority look like they're more happy about it, we'll have to see this report, as I say.
Well, it's interesting. Sorry to jump in, but you're quite right. Within 24 hours of the Streatham low traffic neighbourhood being suspended pending more bus priority, which I'm translating as actually we'll see what happens in the mayoral election, and then we might whip it back in once Sadiq Khan gets re-elected, but let's see. But within 24 hours of that, you're quite right, The Guardian managed to see a copy of this delayed review by the Department of Transport commissioned by the Prime Minister on low traffic neighbourhoods, and The Guardian are claiming that low traffic neighbourhoods work and are extremely popular. However, if you delve down into the report, it actually tells you that the polling was carried out inside 4 sample low traffic neighbourhoods. So they didn't ask people on the surrounding roads, they didn't ask people on the boundary roads, they asked the people inside the low traffic neighbourhoods who now have these quiet little cul-de-sacs and these enclaves without traffic. Who out of them is going to say, no, I'd like more traffic, please? It's not a rounded view of those people who are affected by this. It's just a propaganda puff piece by people who are clearly furious the Streatham one was removed.
Well, I think that's right. And also, we'll have to see a little bit more about it. But in Wigan and York, they're very particular examples, which is 2 of the places. We know in Birmingham that over 50,000 people have not played their clean air zone challenge, and they've been upheld. And what we've got is this discussion where, like, Peter Walker likes to present it as conspiracies. This is the word that's used now for general members of the public that ask questions or are not happy by certain things. That's what now constitutes, it seems like, either being far right or conspiracies. It's utterly contemptuous of the public, like those so-called consultations have been about low traffic neighbourhoods, which are a constant embarrassment to the local authorities. And I think the thing is, and this is really important for the upcoming general election, the local elections, the mayoral elections in May the 2nd, is that people should have their voices heard. They should hold candidates and elected representatives accountable. They should say, where do they stand on low traffic neighbourhoods? Where do they stand on the question of net zero? Should that we have a pledge together saying, are MPs and others going to sign the pledge, which is about having transparency on a proper cost-benefit analysis on net zero? What does it mean? Not just in the abstract. What's it mean for jobs and what's it mean for travel? Does it mean that we're going to have just surveillance and fines? And, you know, where are all the services that everyone keeps talking about? This thing about public transport, you know, the irony of ironies, in Bath, the Lib Dems have pushed this ring of steel. They've pushed these low traffic neighbourhoods, these impositions with a really iron rod. And yet, at the same time, they've withdrawn funding from many of the bus services.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And actually, the Centre for London found that in the wider London boroughs, the outer London boroughs, where the ultra-low emission zone was brought in under the cover that it will provide loads of clean air, and that actually that there's public transport in sufficient amounts in order to justify the ultra-low emission zone expansion, which, by the way, Sadiq Khan's own impact assessment found would have negligible impact on the air quality. The Centre for London found that only 20% of homes in those outer boroughs were within 500 metres of public transport, meaning that 80% of homes on the outer boroughs where the ultra-low emission zone was brought in do not live within a 500-metre walk of public transport. So it is just, of course, the way in which they can fleece people who need to use their cars because they don't have public transport nearby in order to try and revenue raise from all of this. And I think the really important point you just made there is that, Alan, is that there would be some logic to this if they said, when it comes to 15-minute cities or low traffic neighbourhoods or anything, if they said, right, we are going to spend X amount of money making the best public transport going, and it's going to be cheap, it's going to be efficient, it's going to be quick, and it's going to be all of those things, then we'll talk about whether we need to penalise people. At least you might be against it, but you would understand the logic of doing the groundwork first in order to facilitate people making a different decision. But they're not doing it that way. They're restricting people from being able to use their cars when the alternative isn't in place.
Absolutely. Well, it's a cash grab with surveillance and restrictions. It's cameras everywhere. It's fines. It's a money shaking exercise. And there are not just public service, public provision for transport. There's no services either. So when we're talking about these areas, you still can't get to see a GP. We love to see Renee on TV, and
well, that's the only way you get to see a GP.
No.
Exactly.
People in Harrogate get to see me.
Well, people get to see you, but it's so difficult now. And people talk about these 15-minute or 20-minute neighbourhoods as though that everything's provided there. Where are the services? Where's the provision? If you're going to have an urban planning and a regional and a rural planning scheme and system, and I'm really for having a very ambitious one, then you need to be able to have provision and account for people. The other thing we should note is that they'd be so flippant in The Guardian about this, but we know that in Wales, with the 20 miles an hour and with the low traffic neighbourhoods and the limits that are being imposed, that emergency vehicles were delayed, couldn't go certain places. We know that's the case across various cities in the UK. Across the board, there's so many negative impacts. There's so many clear things that people can see.
But Tarquin gets his clean street so he can play outside, Alan.
I'm also a big advocate of playing outside. And one of the points about that is that all sorts of things have changed in the last 30 years, like helicopter parenting and people being scared about leaving their kids outside. The actual impact of children being damaged by cars and harmed by cars is not that it's gone proportionally higher. What's happened is our perceptions of risk and everything have all completely been...
But also, if they go to a park, I mean, I understand if you are in an area where there isn't green space, maybe there's an argument to say you need to play in the street. But in many of the places where they're closing the roads, there's a park next to them.